Chapter 12, Part B. So special education is actually the program in schools that delivers services for children with disabilities. The federal legislation has been around since, I think it was first passed in 1975, and it was called PL 94-142. When I was going to school, that's what it was called. I was still in high school, though, then. But it prescribes the services that all children with disabilities must receive at public education expense. It's part of your constitutional right, because it's called FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education. And your Constitution guarantees that you can have a free, appropriate public education. And that was actually originally decided for when we desegregated Brown versus Board of Education. That was what they came up with, that all citizens of the United States are entitled to a free, appropriate public education. So that's that one right here where it talks about free, appropriate public education. So there's just basic tenets of, and by the way, after 1975, it's been reappropriated like 2 or 3 times. The last one was in 2012 when it came out to be IDEA. And it's individual education. The things that you have to have with that is least restricted environment, or LRE. And that means that children with disabilities have to be served with their non-disabled peers as much as they possibly can. So you can't just put kids in a special ed class and forget about them. They have to be with their non-disabled peers as much as possible. It also means that they really have to be tested on the same types of tests as the kids of their non-disabled peers if they're able to do it. Because otherwise they have to get something called a special diploma. Their IEP is a document, a legal document that is created every year that talks about what goals that they will be meeting on a yearly basis to try and catch them up to their special ed peers. I mean their regular ed peers. They have due process rights, and it's kind of 2 ways. In 2012, it came out. Parents can sue schools related, or have a hearing for schools related to a conflict of their special education services. If they don't think that their child's rights are being not met, or they're not getting a free and appropriate public education, they can sue. It used to be that only parents could sue, and the school district had to pick up the legal bill. But now, because there was a lot of parents that were putting in some frivolous lawsuits, a lot of frivolous lawsuits. Like this one lady used to move every 3 months and make the school completely retrofit the school for her daughter in a wheelchair. But, which was kind of silly because it cost a lot of money. And they would do it if they needed to for somebody that was in that area. But the lady just kept moving to make more and more schools handicap accessible. She was like on a mission. But schools can go back, and they can also turn around and sue the parents for not allowing special services and stuff like that, because sometimes parents don't want to put their kids in special ed. They have to have a non-discriminatory assessment, which means that they have to be given their assessment for whatever disability they're trying to be tested for in their native language, or at least as close to their native language to get a true test score as possible. Schools must pay for related services such as transportation. That's why you got to be real careful and not tell parents like that their child needs to see a therapist and stuff, because if it ends up getting in on any kind of legal document or on the IEP or anything like that, then the school is responsible for paying for it. We've had teachers at times in one school district that I worked with that would actually put on the IEP that the child needed their medication. And when they put that on the IEP, that required the school district to pay for their medication because it was considered to be a related service. I already talked to you about FAPE. Mediation and resolutions. Parents have the right to choose, if they want, to mediate or go through resolution sessions to resolve differences of what they think is going on with their child. You can transfer rights when a student reaches age of majority, because you have the right to go to school till you're 21. But you reach the age of majority at 18. In Michigan, you can go to your 25. The school shall notify both parents and the students to transfer all rights of the parents to the child. So the child doesn't lose their benefits when they turn 18. They can still go to school till they're 21 or graduate, whichever one comes first. Discipline. Kids with exceptionalities cannot be suspended for more than 10 days. Let me see it. It is suspended expelled or suspended for 10 or more cumulative days in a school year without a manifest determination as to whether or not the child's disability is related to the inappropriate behavior. That's why I think I told you guys earlier in one of the lectures, don't remember which one, I did my dissertation on kids who were expelled from school, and there's a special school for them because they were emotionally disturbed. They had already been labeled emotionally disturbed. So if you're emotionally disturbed and you're expelled, you can't be expelled from school because your behavior more than likely is a manifestation of your handicap. And the students with disabilities must be included in the district-wide and statewide assessment programs with appropriate accommodations. So if you need double time, you have double time. If you need a reader other than for the reading section, you can have a reader. If you need a Braille machine, you have it in Braille. If you need a speak text, you have it in speak text. There's all kinds of stuff that goes along with that. But children who cannot pass or participate in the district or state tests must have an alternative assessment that's provided for them based on their IEP goals. Transition planning, at the age of 16, the child must be included because you want to transition to them to work or to adulthood, and they have to be part of that. There's an array of special ed services that are outlined by the IEP. We already talked about least restricted environment, kind of went through this kind of stuff. Continuum of services talks about like where do kids fall out in the spectrum. I taught kids who were in a self-contained residential school or special residential school. The school was at the residential place, but it was a public school that was housed on a treatment center for children with emotional and behavioral disorders. I did work in a regular public school as well, but that one was just a school that I worked at for like 5 years. It was just a school that was housed at a treatment center. So that's one of the more restricted ones. My daughter was on hospital homebound, which means that she pretty much got most of her instruction on the computer because she was hospitalized or she was pretty much confined to her bed for quite a while. But that's the highest end of the spectrum. That's like the most severe that you can get. Direct or indirect consultation and support from a general education teacher. So you are in a regular ed classroom and you just have a special ed teacher kind of check base with you and check on how you're doing. You can have special education up to 1 hour per day where they might go to maybe a pull-out class, or they have the teacher comes in and pushes into their classroom. A resource program usually is when they go 1 to 3. They might go for reading and math, and they go to that class just for it. Special education more than 3 hours a day is pretty much considered to be self-contained, where they're in a self-contained classroom for all of their core subject areas. I also taught self-contained EBD for a while, so all of my kids stayed with me pretty much throughout the day, except for they went to special areas and they had, like PE and art and all that kind of stuff. I did mainstream a couple kids out for certain subjects, but that they were considered to be self-contained. Special day school is where they don't actually live there. They just go there. There's centers for like children with visual and hearing impairments, but they don't live there. There's centers for children with emotional and behavioral disorders, but they, go home every night. They don't have quite as many as those they used to, but they still do. And then we already talked about residential school, which is one I worked at, and then hospital homebound. Pretty much the referral system, this is very simplistic in your book because I'm going to talk a little bit more about it when we get to response to intervention. Most districts have adopted that whole idea of response to intervention, but it's a pre-referral. And the teacher attempts to remediate problems in the general education classroom. Matter of fact, they don't just attempt. They have to prove that they have tried 3 different things and they have failed in order for them to move up. A bottom line is, though, even if you're doing any type of testing or doing any type of documentation on how a kid is not performing in your class or any kind of concerns that you have about their performance that you're starting to collect data on, the family has to be notified that this is happening. And then once the referral happens, let's say you tried your 3 things and they didn't work, the student is referred for evaluation, and the family must provide written consent for the team to evaluate the child. Typically, they send it to somebody called an SS team or a special services team. Sometimes it's a student success team. For somehow or another, they always make it SST, and it stands for different things. Then they do some kind of assessment where the child, maybe a school psychologist will come in and and look at how long the kid's on task. Sometimes a psychometrician or a school psychologist also will work with and do IQ tests. They might do ADHD tests. They might do anxiety tests. They might do depression tests. They might do an IQ test for mental retardation. They will do an adaptive behavior scale test. There's all different kinds of ones that they can do. And then they have to see, is the child not learning? Because you can have emotional disturbance, but if you're real smart and you're just cooking along in school, you may not be certified because your disability is not handicapping you. Then the committee will meet, and the special education professionals meet with the family. It's usually a special ed teacher, the regular ed teacher or teachers, a guidance counselor, a school social worker, a school psychologist if they had an IQ test. Either the principal or vice principal many times sits in on that. If it's somebody who's medically fragile, a nurse will sit in on it, and then the parents. So they get in together and they pretty much determine through all the data whether or not the child meets the need, the category of whatever category they're being tested in. Then you have an IEP meeting, usually right at the exact same time, where they develop the goals that they want the child to work on, and then what services are going to be provided. And then once a year, you have to reevaluate. You have to assess the IEP and see how far you got, and then you have to reevaluate and make new goals for the next year. Some of the basic terminology, and by the way, special ed uses tons of acronyms, is mainstreaming, and inclusion is another word that they talk about that your book talks about full inclusion, but mainstreaming is the temporal, instructional, and social integration of eligible, exceptional children with normal peers based on ongoing, individually determined educational plans and programming processes. I used to mainstream my kids for, I have this little guy, Gerald. He was really cute. But he was really good in math. So even though I had him most of the day for reading and everything else, he had some severe behavior problems. Every day when this one fourth grade teacher taught math, I would send him to the fourth grade math class because I wanted him to start realizing that he could do it there and that he was more than capable. And by the time he got to middle school, we were able to try him out in regular ed with just consultation. LRE, which I already talked about, is least restricted environment. We've had this all the way since 94-142, and that means that how much time that is humanly possible for that kid to spend with their regular ed peers, that's where they should be. Inclusive education is students attend their home school with their age and grade peers. It requires that the proportion of students labeled for special ed is relatively uniform with all other schools within a particular district. See, what happens sometimes is they tried to keep the numbers proportional because they would go in somewhere and there would be like a really high disproportion of kids with learning disabilities, and they're like, wait a minute. Or they might have way too many EBD kids, which means that statistically it shouldn't be happening that way. So maybe it has more to do with the teaching staff than it does to do with, or the identification criteria than it does to do with the actual child having a disability. So inclusive education really tried to make sure that those numbers didn't get out of whack, and then they would send in someone to check that. And then they wanted to make sure that children that were in ESE or exceptional students with exceptionalities were not isolated into a special education class or into special wings of the school, and that they were a vital part of the entire school. Full inclusion is students who are disabled or at risk receive all of their instruction in general education settings, which is support services that come for the student. Partial inclusion is students receive most of their instruction in general ed settings, but most of the students will be pulled out to another instructional setting when it's deemed appropriate for the student's individual needs. So one kid could be pulled out just for math, another one for reading. Your IEP, typically they have a statement indicating the child's PLEP, present level of performance. See, I told you we like to have acronyms. PLEP, and then you have goals indicating the anticipated progress through the year, and then you have short-term objectives, like the student who's having difficulty in reading might be giving one that says, the student will be able to read at a 4.5 level as measured on the Florida State Assessment test by the end of the school year. So it's very specific in giving you some kind of goal of what you want the child to be able to obtain. A statement of a specific special education or related services to be provided, as well as the extent to which the student will participate in general ed program. So you have to actually spell out in minutes how much time they're spending with their regular ed peers, and that's to ensure the LRE. So that, it might be recess, it might be at lunch, it could be something like that. It also must have the projected date for initiation of services and the anticipated duration of services. So it's not just going to keep ongoing. It's going to have a beginning and an end. It can be renewed every year, but every 3 years, it must have a complete redo to see whether or not they still qualify for that service. And then it should have evaluation criteria and procedures for measuring progress towards the goals on at least an annual basis. Here's an example of an IEP. Your book has it. Let me look and see where it is. On page 323. And as you can see, it's a pretty, I wouldn't say complicated form, but it's a dense form. It has a lot of material and information on it. And it tells you like who's going to evaluate it, what is the criterion for evaluation, when will it be done with, and all that kind of stuff that goes along with it. This is a legal document, which means that the school can be held by it in court. So that most of the times the districts will make sure that there's no mistakes or errors on these, but you want to make sure that you're participating in that, because your name might be up here under, who's responsible for it under the evaluation, like who's supposed to do that. How often is it supposed to be done? If you're supposed to give an informal reading test, 4 times a year, you better have that data when you come back to the next IEP. Sorry. My husband's texting me. Response to intervention is the newest thing under IDEA, under 2004. And we've just I know it seems like it's not that new because it's like over 10 years, almost 13 years now, but it took us a couple years to get it together. What it actually does is it's in 3 tiers, response to intervention. And when we look at the tiers for RTI, what we're actually doing is, if I go over here, it's Tier 1 is prevention. So you actually are screening kind of for special ed in Tier 1, where you provide some kind of, you improve your whole class teaching. So you're teaching something. And then you work on the whole class reform or improve some kind of classroom management. But they do some kind of a test with that. And they take the kids that are scoring. What they actually will do is they have, I'm going to draw a little graph, and they have a projection line. So this is 3rd grade. Let's say that they expect the kids to begin right here in 3rd grade, and then they'll give a test maybe in that first few weeks, and they do a scatter plot and they see where does all the kids fall. You got one kid that's falling way up here, and notice these 2 kids right here that are at the bottom. If you were to draw a line with theirs and you were to keep it, they would continue to be below grade level where they're supposed to be. So one of the things they do is then you have to have an intervention. So it might be in the beginning in Tier 1, what they do is they'll identify the kids and then they pull them more for some more intensive small group reading. They might look at what they're missing and just do a little bit of hurdle help and help them up and try and get them back on track. And then they'll do their next one. They do their next test. And the kids, this same kid was down here, and then the other kid's up here. Well, if you were to take the other kid and you do that line, lo and behold, they're going to make it back up, right? They're going to make it back on the line. Where this kid is really going to be behind by the end of the year. So if the kid that made it up, providing one-on-one or small group instruction was okay, but pulling them apart, pulling them back and giving them that hurdle help, if that helped, then that one child who was going to be back on track doesn't need to be going to special ed. You might just every once in a while pull him in and give him a little hurdle help. The other child, because it looks like he's going to really get behind, if that then you're going to give him to Tier 2 intervention. And then you start doing one-on-one tutoring and some more small group tutoring, and you're going to give a little bit of additional time. What also ends up happening there is sometimes they'll bring in like a reading specialist or a math specialist, depending on what subject it is. And that person will also work with them. If it's a kid with behavior problems, you'll do some kind of behavioral support. And if after you start doing that, the child is still looks like they're not going to get online, then, get on to grade level. Then you want to go to that tier 3, really intensive. And you're still going to do the one-on-one tutoring. You're still going to provide the small group. But that child also will be doing behavioral supports. But that's when the kid actually, like in Volusia County, when they get to tier 3 intensive intervention, that's when the child actually goes up for the SST. That's when the child actually turns to be staffed in special education. These first tier 1 and tier 2 happen in a regular ed classroom with a regular ed teacher. They're not getting any real special services there. So tier 1 refers to that whole class strategies designed to help all students. Some of the examples they give you are giving clear and simple directions, study strategies and metacognitive skills, teaching kids how to, their study strategies, starting to use some more cooperative learning so that their peers can help teach them as well after you've taught them, and then making sure that you have effective behavior management. Tier 2, the best intervention professors, if the kids are still falling behind and they need help, they usually have some kind of targeted assistance rather than just kind of general assistance. The student who's struggling in reading might get small group instruction. You might have a reading coach that comes in and works with them on a specific thing. You might have a teacher's aide that helps out, stuff like that can go along. But we're hoping that even if they get that kind of extra help there, then they're going to be able to pull it back up. And then, as you said, tier 3, it's long lasting, and the strategies don't really change. The intensity and duration changes. And those are the kids that are really, really struggling. And typically in most districts, that's where you'd put a kid up for special ed services. We already talked a little bit about inclusion. Full inclusion includes children in general ed classes when appropriate assistance. Proponents of full inclusion argue that pull-out programs discourage effective partnerships between regular and general ed teachers. I think that's pretty much true. And that students in pull-out programs are stigmatized. My kids were, when I used to walk, they say, oh, we're in the boom boom room. I'm like, what's the boom boom? It's where all the dummies go. And I'd say, you know what, guys? I teach emotionally disturbed kids. That means you can't control your temper or else you're really, really sad. And the bottom line is that's something that you can learn. I've never taught kids with low IQs because in order to be emotionally and behaviorally disordered, you have to have a normal IQ. So you can say a boom boom room because you can't keep your behavior in check. But it's not because you're dumb. Proponents of full inclusion say that special ed teachers or paraprofessionals team with classroom teachers and provide student services within the classroom, general ed classroom. My husband used to go, he actually followed in middle school the same schedule as his ESE kids. He had a group of 8 kids that he went to their first period, their second period, their third period, so they kind of traveled together so he could help out each teacher at each period. The research on inclusion, often referred to as mainstreaming, has focused on students with learning disabilities mostly, and then mild intellectual disabilities, and then mild emotional disorders. And it can be, there's been mild academic success. There's been statistically significant differences, and the kids are doing better. Several studies have compared students with mild academic disabilities in special ed class to those in general ed class. And when the general education teachers uses an instructional method that's designed to accommodate this wide range of abilities, kids with mild disabilities and regular ed, they tend to do. The range of much better in general ed class than they do in special ed class. Think about it though. The reason they do is if you're getting pulled out for reading every day, you don't know what went on that hour that you were gone. So you're always kind of trying to play catch up. What are effective strategies for students with disabilities in general ed? Teaching learning strategies is good. Adapting your instruction. When we talked about differentiation and we went back to Tomlinson's model of differentiation and a universal design for learning, all of those are designed to meet the needs of special ed kids in general ed class. Early intervention is good too, that we want to catch it early, especially with speech and language. The earlier you catch it, the quicker you're going to solve it. You want to make sure you adapt your instruction. Remember I told you I drew that pyramid and I said that you want to plan for all 3 levels, the top 10%, the middle 80%, and the bottom 10%. We just want to make sure that we do that. We plan for everybody. Teaching learning strategies and metacognitive awareness. This goes back to chapter 6 again, that many students do poorly in schools because they have failed to learn how to learn. That's one of the reasons why we have RTI as well, is to make sure that you didn't just have a crappy teacher. If you have a crappy teacher in first grade, like I told you about that little boy John, if you have a crappy teacher or you missed half of first grade because your parents were, moving around a lot, then it's not that you have a learning disability, it's that you've never been taught. So programs that are directed at helping students learn, such as strategies as note-taking, summarizing, or summarization and memorization methods, have been very successful on adolescents who have learning disabilities. Increasingly, research has identified a variety of strategies for teaching students with learning disabilities to use metacognitive strategies to comprehend what they read. One of the ones that we taught the kids was a sticky note, and you did an exclamation point, a question mark, and a star. An exclamation point was, wow, I didn't know this. A question mark was, I'm not really clear on this, or could you explain this to me in a different way? And then a star meant that you made a connection to this, that they connected it to something in their own life or something that they remembered. And they were able to share those things. So that would be a metacognitive strategy that helps kids with learning disabilities kind of process what they're reading. Prevention and early intervention is huge in special education. The debate over inclusion versus special ed for children with learning problems revolves around the concerns about children's whose academic performance is far below their age mates. Because you got to ask yourself, if the teacher's worrying so much about those kids, what's happening to the regular ed kids? However, many of these children could have succeeded in school in the first place if they had had effective prevention and early intervention programs. There is strong evidence that substantial portions of students who are now in special ed could have been kept out of it had they had an effective early intervention strategy. Tutoring and small group interventions and struggling readers. Your book at one time talked a little bit, I don't remember what chapter it was in, but it was about reading recovery program, and they used to take in the first grade like the bottom 10% of the reading recovery kids, and one of the things that they did with that was they would do intensive one-on-one tutoring with these reading specialists. It was highly successful, but it's really expensive too. So research on a variety of one-to-one and small group tutoring models, like we reviewed it was chapter 9, has shown substantial positive effects on reading performance and struggling readers. Tutors for kids should always be tried, especially with reading, before we label a kid learning disabled. Computers are used a lot of times with kids with IEPs and such like that, because computers provide opportunities for individualized instructions for students with disabilities. And another cool thing about computers is that they're judgment-free. Like, they don't go, oh my God, I can't believe you didn't know that. So first, computers can help students individualize instruction, the method of delivery, the type and frequency of reinforcement, the rate of presentation, and the lack of instruction. Second, computers can give immediate corrective feedback to the child. And then third, computers can hold the attention of children who are easily distracted. For some reason, they like to work on them. And then fourth, computer instruction is motivating and it's patient. It doesn't go, oh, come on. We already talked about peer tutoring, but this really works well with kids with exceptional student in ESE, is that they have a friend that's an age-appropriate friend, and it's typically a buddy system for non-instructional needs and for peer tutoring. The student who volunteers to be a special education student buddy can help that student cope with the routines of just general life that goes along with it. Special education teams. When a student with disabilities is integrated into the general education classroom, the classroom teacher often works with one or more special ed teachers to ensure their success. The classroom teacher might participate in conferences with special ed personnel. A special educator must many times are present in the classroom. Or the classroom teacher might consult with the special education teacher at regular intervals. We call those itinerant teachers, where they'll come in and they're just there for like a day or two, but they meet with the regular ed teacher and ask them what kind of supplementary material they need or if they're having any problems. We also have to talk about social integration of students with disability. Just placing a kid in a general education classroom is only part of it. You have to actually teach them a lot of times how to make a friend. They have a very difficult time, especially kids with intellectual disabilities and autism, generalizing things that they've learned before. So the classroom teacher has to play a critical role. And there's a lot of research on teacher expectations and student achievement and behavior. So if you expect the kids to behave well and you expect them to get along, they tend to do that. Into case studies, about kids with disabilities, your attitude toward that student is the most important thing. Because student interactions and how they treat that other child is based on how they see you treat that child. And that is the end of chapter 12.